what Russia's going to do likely is reject the terms of the plan, but not do so publicly, so that it doesn't blow up publicly in the Russians' hands, and it doesn't make Russia look like they're bad. And of course, what the Russian foreign ministry and Kremlin spokespersons' offices are going to say, oh, Russia is open to negotiating, of course, and we're looking for the basis of constructive plans and that sort of thing, yada yada yada. But in reality, it's a little bit of rejection, and we must ensure that there's a strategic clarity here, that actually every time it's the Ukrainians will make concessions. The 28 point peace plan, the 19-point peace plan, again, those entail concessions for the Ukrainians, very few, if any, concessions for the Russians. And even then, when the Russians reject it, they need, we can't just give them everything they want. So it'll be very interesting to read the tea leaves of the statements that come out. But I think the key thing to orient on is the Russians are going to reject this plan.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1,379 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we're very privileged to be talking to George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War and to get his insights as to what's going on in reality. George is the Russia team and geospatial intelligence team lead on Russia and on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio for ISW, as I said, and an old friend of Frontline. George, welcome back to Frontline.
Hey, Philip. Good morning. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Lovely to have you, because there's an awful lot of confusion out there at the moment about what's going on in reality. You know, we see so many Russian commentators talking about how Pokrovsk and other towns have collapsed and Russia is in total control of them. And we see Putin coming out with that narrative as well. But the reality is completely different. The Ukrainians are saying they haven't fallen, and we see pictures from Ukrainian troops within the areas. What's the reality on the front line at the moment?
So the reality is this: the Russians are deeply committed in conducting what we call cognitive warfare effort to convince us of the following two things. That number one, that the Red Army is back, the Red Hordes are pouring into Ukraine, and that Russia's military victory is, number one, inevitable, but also, number two, imminent. And neither of these things are necessarily true. And to this effect, look, the Russian Ministry of Defense is doing a variety of things, preemptively claiming seizure and control over particular villages and settlements and towns, including, as of yesterday, December 1st, Pokrovsk. They're claiming a variety of other things. And the whole point is to create this mental map of what's happening, which is essentially the Ukrainians are on the precipice of a operational catastrophe. The lines are about to collapse. The Russians are imminently about to seize the remaining 5,800 square kilometers of Donetsk they don't occupy. And therefore, the United States should tender a surrender document and give to Russia the things that Russia, in reality, are unable to actually achieve militarily and warfight for. The battlefield scenario and reality is this. The lines move tactically. They move in the favor of Russia for the most part tactically. In some places, the Ukrainians counterattack, and it moves tactically in the favor of the Ukrainians, but to a much lesser extent. I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture here, but the war has a positional nature, and large operational breakthroughs from either side remain very, very unlikely. Neither side are able to use mechanized equipment above the platoon level. I mean, we see the use of tanks and armored personnel carriers, but they're mostly used to taxi infantry. And the main unit for maneuver warfare are these dismounted infantry groups of 3 to 5 people. And so when you do have something that eventually happens, like the fall of Pokrovsk, which we assess is eventually going to happen, as of the morning of December 2nd, we don't assess that has yet happened. And we think the Russian claim was likely a little premature. But again, I don't want to get into the business of dying on that hill, because the Ukrainians will lose Pokrovsk soon anyhow. If they haven't indeed already. But that doesn't lend itself to a large operational breakthrough, because the drone warfare has changed the nature of the war. This is not 1918. This is not you're on the Western Front and you're Germany in 1918, and all of a sudden you're going to have a collapse of your lines. The lines are actually the technology and the tactics and the way that the forces have optimized themselves for positional warfare mean that the lines move very slowly. And for the Russians to continue war fighting, it's going to take them a long time to get to these territorial goals that they've set out for themselves. And so therefore, it's very important that we orient ourselves on the fact that the reasonable place for negotiations to proceed from are the de facto contact lines and modifications of that, not we preemptively surrender the rest of Donetsk as the basis for the starting point for the negotiations.
Now, within Donetsk, a couple of things here. Pokrovsk is going to fall, or the Ukrainians are going to make a decision to withdraw from it and allow the Russians to consolidate the rubble that they've got left there, and move their main defensive position back to other pre-prepared defenses. Do you think the Ukrainians have got strong pre-prepared defenses back and can set the conditions to hold the Russians up yet again for 12 to 18 months as they try to focus on another defensive line or city or town and throw everything at it? And do you think that the cost to the Russians, and we've heard Zelensky talking about this, I think it was just before he went to Ireland, he made a speech and he turned around and said, it's not about the territory, it's about the cost that we can impose on the Russians. Do you think that's the factor that the Ukrainians are taking into account? And what are they doing with the time that they're buying and that cost? How important is that to the Russians?
Yeah. So two big thoughts come to me from those questions. We know for a fact that there are Ukrainian field fortifications and prepared positions further to the west of Pokrovsk. And so they do have positions that they can leverage. And this is part of the basis of my assessment that even when Pokrovsk falls, it's not as if it's going to blow a giant hole and you're going to have, Army Group Center, to make a World War II analogy, sort of plow its way through and thrust deep into central Ukraine, because there are other positions they can hold there. And the lines do move slowly, and the Russians are not able to mass anything larger than a platoon's worth of mechanized vehicles in any given location. So that's first thought. The other thought is there's more to the salient of the cauldron that the Russians have forwarded around Pokrovsk and just Pokrovsk. There's also Mirnograd, which is very slightly to the northeast of Pokrovsk. And the Russians, for the most part, have not penetrated that sort of satellite town nearly as deeply as they have into Pokrovsk, but the route for exfiltration and evacuation would be the same. And so obviously we would have to look up and think about, can the Ukrainians withdraw in good order from Mirnograd after the fall of Pokrovsk? The Ukrainian military, as of yesterday or 2 days ago, was claiming that they had established some alternative evacuation routes and that they've managed to do some unit rotations. I'm not able to verify that. But it seems like from all what we've seen that they're okay. But I will tell you, if you look at the map, it does look quite precarious. I'm very concerned for the Ukrainians that are in Mirnograd. So if Pokrovsk falls rapidly or suddenly, and the few 100 meters of terrain that is basically preventing an encirclement are lost, then that could look bad from Mirnograd. And it already looks bad because you don't have to physically control every meter of the exfiltration route, given you can interdict it with artillery and mortars and drones and other direct fire, indirect and direct fire weapons. So it's a sticky situation there. In terms of the negotiations and what's going on here, look, I think a lot of these Russian announcements and efforts to intensify the operations, these are designed to, again, shape the Trump administration's understanding of the battlefield, to manipulate their understanding of the battlefield and cajole them into accepting terms that are much, much worse. The good news is that ever since we had about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, the leaked 28-point peace plan, there's been a number of good revisions to that plan. So it was originally a 28-point peace plan. And then the Sunday before Thanksgiving here in the States, Marco Rubio went to Geneva to meet with the Ukrainians, when it then got reduced down to a 19-point peace plan. And we don't know what the 19 points are, but my understanding is that a number of the most problematic provisions were just cut, and then other ones were amended. And then last Sunday, just a few days ago, Marco Rubio met with Ukrainians in Miami again to further workshop it. And now we have December 2nd, Steve Witkoff going to Moscow to, I think, present these terms to the Russians. And we had to have a plan for what is to happen the day after the Russians reject this plan, because they're going to have to, because the plan does not actually acquiesce to all of the Russian maximalist demands. And this is really where the Trump administration has a decision point to face, which is, are we going to allow Putin to keep stringing us along? He has this rejectionism about him. Every time that we come with him with a proposal, a ceasefire, something, he always rejects it. We had the Alaska summit, which was a waste of time. We've had previous, proposed Easter ceasefires and things like that, and he's got to pay a price. We have, sanctions bills. We have the ability to improve Ukraine's weapons supplies. We have a lot of these things up our sleeves that we need to consider to play. So I hope the administration has that part clear, but we shall see.
Well, it's interesting. Marco Rubio seems to be the one that has taken what Steve Witkoff brought back from Russia and presented as a US plan, and then turned it into something that's a little bit more sensible. Do you have confidence that with Steve Witkoff taking it back to Moscow and not Marco Rubio taking it there, and Steve Witkoff being backed up by Jared Kushner, that there's actually anything of any sense going to come out? Or do you think Putin will take the opportunity to try and spin something back again, that Witkoff will come back and say, if we just do this and give Vladimir Putin this little bit of what he wants, then he'll sign a peace deal?
I suspect it's going to be more the latter, because all of the trends and the patterns. Whenever we see Witkoff do this, he goes to Moscow thing, or he meets the Russians in the Middle East thing. It's always that pattern. And so, but I also think the Russians are likely to reject the plan, but do so not publicly. And I think they're going to reject the plan simply because if you study what Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov said last week, what Putin said in his big speech on November 27th in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, they're indicating that they're not willing to abdicate their maximalist war aims and their demands for territory and things that would severely compromise Ukraine's integrity and sovereignty as a regular country. It essentially exists as a country with a truncated sovereignty that doesn't, some countries are equal, but some are less equal than others. And that would be the case for Ukraine. So I think they're going to reject it. But interestingly, the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, yesterday also said that we're not going to do negotiations over the loudspeaker, over the microphone. We're going to do this professionally. We're going to do this quietly. And I think that's actually quite tactful, because what Russia's going to do likely is reject the terms of the plan, but not do so publicly, so that it doesn't blow up publicly in the Russians' hands, and it doesn't make Russia look like they're bad. And of course, what the Russian foreign ministry and Kremlin spokesperson's offices are going to say, oh, Russia is open to negotiating, of course, and we're looking for the basis of constructive plans and that sort of thing, yada, yada, yada. But in reality, it's a little bit of rejection. And we must ensure that there's a strategic clarity here, that actually every time it's the Ukrainians will make concessions, the 28 point peace plan, the 19-point peace plan, again, those entail concessions for the Ukrainians, very few, if any, concessions for the Russians. And even then, when the Russians reject it, they need, we can't just give them everything they want. So it'll be very interesting to read the tea leaves of the statements that come out. But I think the key thing to orient on is the Russians are going to reject this plan.
Do you think the fact that the Russians pushed this 28-point peace plan, first of all, and the Russian disinformation operation that's going on about what the reality is on the tactical front line, is all an indication that Putin is actually sitting in Moscow quite worried about where the conflict is going for him at the moment? And he sees an opportunity to play Donald Trump through Steve Witkoff, and that being a way that he could try and get out of jail free in some way, or with something that he can declare as a victory, and park things till he gets his military and his economy and everything else sorted out again. Do you think the reality is Putin is in a much worse position and weaker position than we're actually thinking?
Yeah, I think that's basically true. If you look at Russia's GDP, I believe it's somewhere around $2 trillion. If you look at the international coalition supporting Ukraine, it's multiple orders of magnitude around that. If we lean into supporting Ukraine and defeating Russia, then Russia cannot conventionally win this war. They can't conventionally win this war when Ukraine has been kept on an anemic diet, and we drip feed Ukraine aid and do so sort of reluctantly and on delayed timelines and all that sort of thing. There are indicators that are very bad for the Russians right now. In mid-November, they started selling non-liquid assets, gold reserves, for the first time. Putin last Friday, also in late November, signed a new VAT, value-added tax. He upped it from 20% to 22%. Um, the Russians are in the business right now of retooling their fourth generation system to start a pipeline for the compulsory mobilization of reservists, as opposed to this previous we pay you tremendous amounts of funds to go volunteer in Ukraine system. So these economic issues are maturing, and they are becoming a problem for Putin. I don't know. I don't like to say he's worried. I don't like to say that I don't. Firstly, I don't know what Putin thinks, and I don't want to hyperbolize it. But there are constraints to the Russian war machine, and you wage a full-scale, high-tempo, large-scale combat operations for 4 years and 5 years when you didn't plan for it to be a 5-year war. You planned for it to, in fact, be a very short war, and you've made some questionable strategic resourcing decisions. Yeah, these things protract and they become bad, and so therefore Putin is very vested in us at the negotiating table making concessions that secure for Russia terrain, territory, political conditions that Russia is in no place to actually seize for itself on the battlefield.
Well, we see Ukraine imposing its own sanctions on Russia by destroying Russia's oil and gas capability and a lot of its military factories and everything else, and destroying a lot of the manpower that is needed for the factories. Hence why Russia's now asking for North Koreans to come in and man some of the factories and bits and pieces. But we've seen recently even more audacious attacks from the Ukrainians. Every time we see Operation Spider's Web and think back on that and smile and think that was very bold, all of a sudden something else seems to come into the press. And the latest one is the sinking of 2 Shadow Fleet tankers in the Black Sea, well away from Russian territorial waters and Ukrainian territorial waters, and rumours around the potential for an attack being on another Shadow Fleet tanker off the coast of Senegal is what I'm saying. Whether there's any truth to that or not, I don't know, but certainly the Black Sea Fleet ones or the Black Sea attacks have happened. How important do you think these sorts of attacks are, and how worried do you think the Russians are that they're now being hit well away from where the war is actually happening, and the impact that that'll have on their economy and ability to continue to fund it?
Yeah. I am of the professional assessment that you can't win this war through economic tools alone. Economic tools, of course, are good. Degrading Russian source revenues, income and state revenue sources are good. However, victory has to come in the form of imposing military defeats, and the sanctions, the oil stuff, all good, all excellent supporting efforts, but by themselves insufficient. So I think these are good. But I will say I think there's a legal risk that comes with targeting these Russian vessels. I'm glad that the Ukrainians are degrading it, and on one hand, I think on the other hand, it's also legally a tricky thing, because these are, technically speaking, not military vessels. They are civilian vessels. They are enablers, so you could argue under maritime law that there's sustainment or support. I'm not sure. I'm not a maritime legal expert, but this could open up a sticky situation where the Russians can then decide to retaliate by targeting other civilian shipping vessels that are going to and from Odessa, and then you could have a sticky situation there. So I'm not sure. I need to do a little bit more thinking about how I feel about this. Look, I'm not prepared to defend what the administration is doing in Venezuela, and I'll be candid with you. I'm an ignoramus when it comes to things that pertain to my own hemisphere, especially in Central South America. I'm primarily, a subject matter specialist on Russia, Ukraine, and so I'll leave it there. And I'm not prepared to comment on what's happening in Venezuela, candidly. Perhaps.
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone knows. It's interesting and stuff, but there are potential for precedences to be set up that could undermine. It could help Vladimir Putin justify what he's done, depending on what happens. I'm hypothesizing about military scenarios when they haven't come out yet, so I'm being very, very unfair. So, what do you think? Putin's going to reject this peace deal. What do you think his next step is going to be? And let's assume that Pokrovska's fallen. What's going to are the next things that we're going to start to see in Ukraine?
So I think what we'll next see are intensification of, well, let me be very clear. We're going to see an operational culmination around Pokrovsk. And I know that this is sort of like a buzzword, but operational culminations are a real thing. We had a long, protracted, multi-month campaign to seize Bakhmut, which culminated back in early 2023. And if you break out your little protractor and look at how far the Russians actually got from Bakhmut after there, the 98th Airborne Division has been stuck in the Bakhmut area and near Chasiv Yar, and now a little bit closer to Konstantinivka ever since 2023. They've moved about 15, maybe 20 kilometers over the course of the last 3 years. So, that those forces are exhausted and they're spent, and that's what that means. I think we're going to see a similar thing around Pokrovsk. The two combined arms armies with the combat power that are currently engaged in the slug for Pokrovsk, they're going to be exhausted at the end of this undertaking, and they're likely not going to be, leading any major effective. I mean, they might get thrown into a new operation while being burnt out and exhausted, but they're not going to be leading any effective major offensive soon. So I think that sector will slow down a little bit, and that means we're going to look to other sectors where the Russians might activate. Two to three areas come to mind, and this is based off of the current Russian order of battle. The Russians have a lot of combat power near Konstantinivka, just to the north. It's one of the fortress belt cities. It's just to the west of Bakhmut. And the Russians have been making some small, limited gains and infiltration missions into the eastern parts of Konstantinivka recently. So there could be a pitched battle for that city. The other place that comes to mind is the southern front line in Zaporizhia. There's a town, an operationally significant town called Huliapole, which has been on the front line since the 2023 counteroffensive. And the Russians actually conducted I would say, tactical breakthrough in recent months where they managed to make some accelerated gains due to finding some weaknesses in the Ukrainian manning on the southern front. And they've actually created sort of a big, long wall to the immediate east of Huliapole, which does not look particularly good. And so the Russians might decide to reinforce success there and try to push towards Zaporizhia. Then the third area that comes to mind is the Liman area in northern Donetsk. On the northern side of the Siversky Donetsk River, there's a town there called Liman, which is, I would argue, also operationally significant. And the Russians have been pushing through very heavy forests in that area to try to get into northern Donetsk, to get to the Siversky Donetsk River, so they can then ford the river and fight against the fortress belt in Kramatorsk and Slavyansk for multiple directions. Because right now that river protects the northern flank, and it's what basically demarks the northern boundary for the battlefield geography. So those are sort of the three areas where I'm looking for intensified Russian pushes. You sort of finish in one sector, so you activate the others. These are the sort of the hypotheses that we have, and there are active combat operations happening here. The final thing that I'll say is there might be some form of intensification in northern Ukraine along the international border. Putin yesterday, as part of his cognitive warfare efforts, re-announced the plans to create a sort of sanitary buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine in the territories that Russia has not yet formally annexed. This is actually not a new declaration. Putin's previously declared the need to create buffer zones in that area. So it's possible we could see some intensification of the efforts there. But I will say the Russian order of battle is not optimized to do large pushes there. In fact, they've been redeploying units from the Sumy area to the east to support the operations in the east. So I suppose the Russians maintain the options to then redeploy forces back to the north. But I think that's for now more likely cognitive warfare information operations.
Reaching a culminating point is not any form of casual language. It's a recognized military term in military planning and all the rest of it. I've done that on many occasions. But do you think Russia, because the Russians we write them off, but they're very good at adapting and reading what's going on and changing their tactics. However, the one thing they seem very bad at is this fixation on towns and cities. They got fixed by the Ukrainians in Mariupol. They got fixed by the Ukrainians in Bakhmut. They've been fixed by the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk, whilst the Ukrainians are carrying out a lot of other attacks and weakening the Russians elsewhere. Do you think the Russians are going to allow themselves to get fixed again in yet another town and take another 12 to 18 months before they can advance through that? And given some of these towns are even bigger, it could take them even longer.
I think they likely will. I mean, look, Pokrovsk is an interesting case study because Pokrovsk was operationally significant. I'm not going to deny the operational significance of Pokrovsk. It was operationally significant as a logistics hub because of the highway that led into it and the railroad. But here's the thing. The Ukrainians stopped using the railroad and the highway for logistics at least 5-6 months ago in June and July of this year when the Russians were able to mass the drones and the artillery assets as the line moved up forward. And the subsequent 6 months of warfighting to seize the ruins of a former town of 30,000 people have actually not rendered any operational gains. I mean, the Russians could have effectively declared, and a smart commander would have said, we've achieved our operational objective of denying it as a logistics hub. You don't have to now go sacrifice tens of thousands of people to go seize the town. And they got fixed there. But here's the thing. When they do seize the town, they get an informational victory because they aggrandize the town. They neglect the fact that they already achieved their objective. They need to be able to point to a map and show, here's how the line on the map changed, and therefore the collapse of Ukraine is inevitable without having any discussion about the price they paid to move their lines 25 miles over the course of 21 months, right? That part of the conversation they leave out. But because they need to actually say, it's not compelling to say, well, we advanced over fields. They need to link these seizures to actual toponyms to make their information operation compelling. And so I actually see these fixation efforts not to be about the military situation, but to be about the cognitive warfare, the cognitive domain. Because if they can rack up a list of toponyms that they've seized, that sounds much more impressive to the policymakers that they are ultimately trying to convince than to say, we advanced this in however many miles and we achieve these operational objectives, because there's a military civilian divide. So the civilian policymakers don't always understand these military considerations, but if they look at a map and it looks like it changed in a bad way, and there's these lists, these toponyms, and they've heard about it in the media for months and months and months, then they might place a undue importance on these sort of things.
But in the time frame that Russia's been fighting this conflict, if we compare that to the Second World War, Russia pushed the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow right back to Berlin. Yes, it cost them 8 to 10 million troops through the whole war. In doing that, they're now sort of 1.2 coming to 1.3 million, but they've only advanced about 40 kilometers, if anything. Do you think this is something that Putin needs or will ever wake up and recognize that he hasn't got the old Soviet power that existed before, and he's never going to have it?
Yeah, for sure. The Russian Ministry of Defense understands that, and they're actually in the business of trying to recreate elements of the old Red Army of World War II and Cold War infamy. It's interesting that you mentioned this, because actually just the other day, one of Russia's naval infantry brigades, the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, was reformed into a division. It's now the 55th Naval Infantry Division. And this is part of the longstanding plans that former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced back in either late 2022 or early 2023, but to form 17 new maneuver divisions, some of which will be stood up from scratch, others of which will be created by reorganizing existing brigades into divisions. But this is important because for those of you that know anything about Russian military history, the Red Army was defined by having a lot of divisions as the main maneuver element for the ground force. So they had a lot of scale, a lot of mass. They had very high echelons. The contemporary Russian Federation undertook a series of reforms in 2008 to downsize to go towards the brigade, very crudely speaking, taking a short version of the history here. They went into Ukraine with the force structure built around brigades, and they actually morphalized them into battalions. But then they realized that they actually can't be a mini version of the United States with professional brigades. They need to leverage mass. The Russians realize they can't actually win wars on the basis of the unit of individual excellence from units, from superior generalship, any of those sorts of things. they need to have mass. And so therefore they're now going back to the Soviet model based on divisions. And of course, it takes a long time to redo a force structure of that magnitude. But there are specters of the old. The Putin is doing things to reintroduce specters of the old into the contemporary. And that, I think, bodes poorly for the continent.
Well, George, on that point, unfortunately, and please don't take this the wrong way, what that means is we're going to have many more opportunities, I suspect, to talk through what's going on in Ukraine through the rest of 2025 and 2026. But George Barros, thank you very much indeed for talking to me today on Times Radio Frontline.
Thanks so much for having me, Philip. Always a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like to be amongst the first to get exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership at the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs or read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.